Welcome to our webinar, Politics, the Media, and the Church's Role in Truth-Telling During the Election Season. This is part of a webinar series on the clergy and congregations navigating the election season, co-hosted by the Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Clergy Emergency League. This session is being recorded and will be made available after we have finished this and are able to get it uploaded to YouTube. Our special guests for this panel are the Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, the Reverend Robert Franick, and the Reverend Dr. Nelson Rabel Gonzalez. Given the media's role in shaping public opinion during the election season, how can the church be wise stewards of truth? This panel this evening will discuss the challenges of preaching, teaching, and pastoral care when misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda are shaping the opinions of parishioners. Our panelists will share biblical, theological, and practical guidance for clergy and congregations to navigate the complex social and political landscape in which we find ourselves, while also maintaining a commitment to integrity and Christ-centered teaching. I invite all of you to put your name and location and your congregation or organization into the chat. Also in the chat during the webinar, you can put your questions for the panelists. There's also a Q&A button where you can put questions in there. And before we tell you more about our panelists, we want to tell you about the two organizations that are hosting this session. Here is Brianna Ilanay to tell us about the Wisconsin Council of Churches.
Thanks, Leah. First, I just want to invite you, if you put your name in the chat or you're in the chat, make sure you put to everyone so that we all can see it, not just the people speaking on the screen. A bit about the Wisconsin Council of Churches. We are a network of Christian churches and faith-based organizations committed to working together across our many differences. Exercising holy imagination, we help one another make courageous choices that lead towards peacemaking, social and economic justice for Wisconsin's most vulnerable residents, the vitality of the church, and the well-being of our neighbors. The council connects 21 Christian traditions, which have within them approximately 2,000 congregations and over 1 million church members. But our resources extend well beyond Wisconsin and serve the faith community throughout the United States. So we partner on things like this and these webinars with the Clergy Emergency League. Now, Leah is going to tell you a little bit about the Clergy Emergency League.
Thank you, Brianna, and it's great to co-host with you again. The Clergy Emergency League started in June of 2020, and we are a grassroots network of more than 2,600 clergy across the United States. We provide support, accountability, resources, and networking for clergy to prophetically minister in their congregations and the public square in this time of political upheaval, social unrest, and partisan division. You can visit our website, which I'll put into the chat shortly, at clergyemergencyleague.org. And we also have our Facebook group, which we will put that into the chat as well. And we are grateful to be able to partner with Wisconsin Council of Churches on this webinar series. And I also want to let you know that we have 2 more coming up. I'm going to do a quick screen share to share with you that we also are going to have a session on preparing for faithful nonviolent resistance this election season. That is coming up in 2 weeks on Tuesday, October 15th at this same time. And we're having another session on the 29th. This will be the 4th of 4, called Depolarizing Congregations and Communities During the Election Season and Beyond. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. The Reverend Dr. Jim Antal is Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the United Church of Christ, General Minister and President. The revised and updated second edition of his book, Climate Church, Climate World, is being read by hundreds of churches. From 2006 to 2018, Jim led the 350 UCC churches in Massachusetts as their conference minister and president. For 20 years, he served as a local pastor in Ohio and Massachusetts. He has preached on climate change since 1988 and over 400 settings and has engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience in numerous occasions. Jim wrote and championed 3 groundbreaking resolutions passed by the National UCC, including the 2013 vote making the UCC the first national church body to vote to divest from fossil fuel companies. He is a graduate of Princeton University, Andover Newton Theological School, and Yale Divinity School. The Reverend Nelson Rabel Gonzalez was born in Puerto Rico and has been an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, since 2002. He has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and worked as a manufacturing process engineer at Motorola in Puerto Rico. He holds a Master of Divinity and a Master of Sacred Theology in Biblical and Lutheran Studies from Philadelphia Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is now United Lutheran Seminary. He was instrumental in helping Faith in the Valley, a Pico, California affiliate, distribute $1.3 million in relief to essential undocumented migrant workers during the COVID pandemic. As a faith leader, he serves the Spanish-speaking communities of Stockton and Lodi as a pastor and founder of Iglesia Luterana Santa Maria Peregrina Lutheran Church in Stockton, California. He is also a member of the Clergy Emergency League Steering Committee. And the Reverend Robert Franick is interim pastor for Richland Our Savior's Lutheran Parish in rural Walcott and Colfax, North Dakota. And he is a member of the Clergy Emergency League Steering Committee as well. Over the past 6 years, he has served as interim pastor for 11 different congregations in 8 parishes in both Illinois and North Dakota. Pastor Franick has a deep interest in the relationship between faith and politics and how we are called as the baptized people of God to love our neighbors through our vocation as citizens, including how who we vote for shapes the public policies of our federal, state, and local governments. He is an avid reader in the area of current events, posts prolifically on social media, and enjoys following the White House, Congress, and Supreme Court and how they are impacting people's lives across the country and around the world. Over the past 9 years, he's taken an interest in media criticism and how the national press covers campaigns, elections, and operations of our federal government. From the summer of 2016 through the summer of 2018, he wrote a weekly column connecting real lives and public policy for Politicus USA. He has also been published in the Washington Post. Pastor Franick is a 2003 graduate of Concordia College, Moorhead, with majors in accounting and religion. He earned his Master of Divinity at Wartburg Theological Seminary in 2007. So, Robert, we're going to start with you. Can you explain to us what has been happening with mainstream media coverage of news and events during this election season, and why this is a serious issue both for our democracy and for our churches?
Thank you, Leah. I will attempt to do that in these next minutes. I want to begin with a brief disclaimer and saying a few positive things because much of what I have to say is not so encouraging. It's important, I think, to know that the corporate legacy media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, Politico, NPR, and the wire outlets like the AP and Reuters do great journalism and employ exemplary and ethical journalists. whose reporting is essential and worth our time as conscientious citizens. More, there is reporting that only large companies like the New York Times and CNN are able to do because of their resources, financial, in areas of expertise, and the scale in which they operate. Personally, I still remain a subscriber to the New York Times and Washington Post, in addition to supporting several independent journalists through their Substack newsletters. The Daily from Politicus USA has been especially informative for helping me understand the problems in much of the political reporting at outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, CNN, many of the Sunday shows like Meet the Press, and even in outlets like NPR, the AP, and Reuters. While the New York Times is among the most egregious of offenders, the problems and critiques apply across the board to most of the mainstream political news media, as much as mainstream is still applicable in today's media context. These problems are especially evident in coverage of this presidential election. I should also add that I am aware of the recent strong editorial endorsements by the New York Times and the New Yorker for Kamala Harris. Nevertheless, much of their reporting and opinion pages has skewed the truth with both sidesism, false equivalencies, and refusing to hold Donald Trump to the same standards as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The free press or fourth estate is supposed to be a check on power and hold the powerful to account. More, the press is tasked with informing the people about their elected political leaders and presenting the truth so the people can better understand their government and make informed choices. Much of the political news media has been failing at this mission for years. For example, instead of writing headlines to inform, headlines are written to create drama. And the problem is that most people only read the headlines and leads of stories and don't make it to paragraph 12 or 17 where important truths are buried. The truth has also been obscured by story placement. Consider which stories are on the front pages of the papers and the top of the web pages, and which ones are buried deep within or several pages of scrolling down from the top. It is no secret that the candidates from each of our two major political parties are held to vastly different standards. Remember the butter emails from the coverage of Hillary Clinton's campaign? In this election year, consider how many articles and opinion pieces called for Joe Biden to drop out of the race, even before the June 27th debate. Now, even after Joe Biden stepped aside, while Donald Trump continues to show increasing signs of his age being an impediment to his ability to carry out the duties of the office of president, the papers are silent about his need to drop out of this race, despite his 2 impeachments, 34 felony convictions, continued cognitive decline, and desire to be a dictator on day one, to say nothing of the policy consequences of Project 2025 for our democracy and on people's lives. Kamala Harris has been targeted for not presenting enough policy details. Then she is criticized for being too much in the weeds and losing voters' attention, while nothing is demanded of Donald Trump and his concepts of a plan. The media also continues to move the goalposts every time she meets one of their demands. In the past 9 years, the political news media has largely not learned how to cover a candidate like Donald Trump, who is a sociopathic liar and is only in this race for his own personal financial benefit, and now to protect himself from the numerous felony indictments he faces. Nevertheless, Donald Trump made a lot of money for the corporate media. His White House leaked like a colander, and reporters were obsessed with getting scoops on the drama inside the administration and turning that into lucrative book deals. Some even saved what could be argued essential information at the time for a juicy nugget to promote their book. Since Donald Trump left office, even in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, the news media has been desperate for scoops and ratings. The Biden administration has considerably less drama, is not a revolving door of cabinet officials, and is doing the work of governing, which most of the political press finds incredibly boring. A particularly loud segment of the political news media is interested in selling gossip as savvy insight and being the gatekeepers to inform readers about what is really going on and what the people inside government are really like. The legacy papers and cable news need consistent drama to keep their readers and viewers engaged. This is their North Star for centering horse race coverage over the stakes of the outcome of the election. As noted media critic and journalism professor Jay Rosen says, they are covering the odds and not the stakes. He argues the press needs to focus less on the odds and much more on the stakes of this election. But polling stories are relatively cheap and easy to provide countless hours of analysis and speculation by journalists and pundits, compared to investigative reporting on how policy is impacting people's lives. Access to the Republican Party is also a reason the political news media treats them with kid gloves, softball questions, and frames most issues around their talking points, forcing Democrats to argue on Republican terms. When faced with challenging questions, accountability for their votes and speeches, Republicans are much more likely to refuse to go on television shows and cut off access to the press. The political news media is also not afraid of losing their liberal left of center audience, no matter what they print or how many pieces saying wash Donald Trump. They are in search of expanding their audience to include everyone, especially this mythical, quote, real American. It doesn't seem to faze the New York Times or CNN that much of this demographic has been conditioned by Donald Trump and his right-wing media operatives to believe that the New York Times and CNN are fake news. Nevertheless, the corporate press will center right-wing talking points, thinking they are being critical of the left and fair to the right. It's also imperative to remember that these outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, CNN, and all the major networks are owned by billionaires who care more about making more money than they do about this country's democracy. This is largely why networks and papers staffed with competent reporters committed to the best of their profession are forced to compromise ethics for executive agendas in making a profit. Right-wing media decades ago convinced both news consumers and the mainstream press that the legacy papers and networks have a liberal bias, when in fact the bias they have is corporate, that is, the business of making money. The fear of being accused of liberal bias is so deep in the minds of many journalists that they overcompensate to be sure that no one can accuse them of this. In an article a few weeks ago, the New York Times tried to take on Donald Trump's lies and incoherent rantings. However, by the end of the article, they let stand the lie that Donald Trump's tariffs are taxing foreign nations. Lawrence O'Donnell took on this egregious failure by the New York Times in a 9-minute commentary, concluding in part, "It's only question about it whether the tariffs would raise enough money to pay for childcare," saying washing Donald Trump's insane response about childcare last week. Nothing in Donald Trump's response said anything about the federal government paying for anyone's childcare. The New York Times hallucinated that explanation into existence, and after hallucinating that explanation into print, the New York Times says it's a disputable policy assumption. No, it's not. It's completely impossible. The fear of being accused of liberal bias, putting the odds over the stakes of this election, rampant both sidesism and false equivalencies, using different sets of standards for the candidates in this presidential race, along with the profit motive, all work together to obscure the truth that is essential for voters to know. Writing in her newsletter, The Daily, Sarah Jones sums up the current state of much of the political news media today. The US media has become an embarrassment of servility to authoritarians, using any normal politician like President Biden as a foil to play the snarling, tough journalist holding power to account by screaming questions so devoid of importance as to render their purpose impotent. This is the challenge of our time. The media will not do its job, and so you all have to do it for them.
Thank you, Robert, for laying out what we are dealing with and that just what we're dealing with and the challenge that it comes to discerning truth and media sources this election. So Nelson, let's turn to you. What are some biblical passages that clergy and congregations can turn to that speak to us about honesty, truthfulness, and the importance of integrity? And then based on those passages, what are some theological themes that emerge for preaching and teaching during this election season?
Thank you for that. Again, thank you, Reverend Dr. Leah Shade and the Wisconsin Council of Churches, to Dr. Jim and Reverend Franek, again, and all the those of you who are attending. And thank you for being here. The first verse that came to my mind was actually the commandment in Exodus 20:16, not to bear false witness. In part because the idea of truth in Hebrew, emeth, right, is interesting because it's made up of three letters: the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, as if the concept of truth is all-encompassing. It's complete and absolute. And in so many ways, to what Pastor Franek was talking about, and behind his wonderful x-ray of the reality that we are discussing, is also the idea when we go from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the concept of aletheia, right? Truth used in the New Testament. I think it's important to note that the word aletheia is an antonym, the opposite of forgetfulness, and in a way, untruthfulness, right? But more so forgetfulness, like as if what the word is trying to convey is the idea that being in truth is being knowledgeable of what's really happening. It's actually also a synonym for reality in ancient Greek and in philosophy. So when you think about then truth theologically, right? God is truth. Jesus said in John 14:6. Now, if we move from the Old Testament and so many ways in which the concept of truth is used as an adjective for who God is and what is the calling for the people of God, not just to be, but also to speak in truth, is to speak reality. And it goes back to what Pastor Franek was talking about, like in so many ways, the people of God, from the ancient Kahal, the ancient gathering of the people of God, to the ecclesia, we're called to be truth tellers. We're called to, in so many ways, describe reality as it is, even if it is hurtful, conflictive, difficult to analyze, digest, and even respond to. The calling is to describe it, because at the end of the day, we are speaking in the name of the one who is truth. And I think that's one of the challenges that our denominations, our churches, our faith communities, regardless of our backgrounds, will have after analyzing the wonderful, again, and Pastor Franek, thank you. That's just a wonderful description of our predicament, not only as a nation, but I think globally, right? In terms of global media, is the fact that the church continues to make this astonishing claim that we speak on behalf of the one who is truth. In a world that is divided among, you might say, there's many universes of little truth. So how can we speak truth when people have different worldviews of what the truth is, right? And I think part of what if you think about it theologically, but also in the sense of how we interact with each other communally, the more perspectives, the more interactions, the more dialogue, the more one-on-ones. And here I am applying a community organizing principle. The one-on-ones are so important for organizers, for churches to get a sense of what are people truly experiencing. What is the aletheia? What is truth? What is reality? And if we stop for a second and realize that truth is always present in the community, it's not something that is out there. In that sense, I think, though, both, when you think about the Christian claim of the incarnation, the truth became one of us. The ultimate truth lived. It lived in a particular context, right? But for us as followers of the truth, that particular context does not negate, and the realities and peculiar nature of the incarnation of Christ, from a Christian perspective, does not negate the fact that we speak of truth. Acknowledging, studying the peculiarities, the context, the history, the language, the culture, it drives us closer to the truth. Isn't that interesting, right? A very peculiar context for billions of people who follow Christ, who claim Christ as the Son of God and as the Savior. That engagement with the truth of the existence of and the context in which Christ lived becomes for them a reality. And I guess what I'm trying to say with this, I went very philosophical, and I apologize for that, but I think when we connect the incarnation with the concept of truth, what we're saying is that truth is never it's always concrete, in the sense, how does a policy, how does a particular government, a particular worldview, a particular idea affects a concrete community, a concrete group of people. Particularly, and I would add this from I'll have to admit my own theological bias for liberation theologies and theologies of liberation, is that the way truth is known the most closely in discussions about policies and politics and how we arrange ourselves as a society, is how is it that any policy, any voting, any process, electoral process, how does it affect the most vulnerable in our community, in our society, in our nation, in the world? And as we get closer and closer to that context of the margins, we find truth. And I would add, we find Christ. Because Christ, and going to Matthew 25, because you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Therefore, we find the one who is truth, according to John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. We find Christ in the vulnerable, in the margins, in the oppressed, LGBTQI plus communities, migrants, women, children, the Palestinian community. And we can go on and on and on. Those affected by, to touch on what Dr. Jim, I'm sure we'll talk about after, environmental racism. I think, and I'll finish with this, I'm okay on time, I can make one final statement. I think of the community of Wilmington in the LA area, here in California, in Los Angeles County, where 34% of the population, mostly 90% of the people who live in Wilmington, are people of color. And the impact of the environmental catastrophe in that region is just incredible. So 34% of them have cancer. And that's like ground zero for the EPA in terms of the impact of the fossil fuel industry here in America, right here in the United States. So, and again, in a very particular way, the more we get closer to, look how the connection between the particular to the universal, right? The closer we get to the reality of how that community is being bombarded by pollution, by policies, and by extreme and wild capitalism, we see how truth really is present and reality itself. We see it. And I would argue theologically, we then see, as we find the truth, we see the face of Jesus Christ. So thank you.
Wow. Reverend Nelson, thank you so much for those biblical and theological resources. I captured some of your quotes and got them in the chat there. Really great. This is going to be so helpful for clergy and congregations in this election season. Now it's time to hear from Reverend Dr. Jim Antal. Jim, can you offer us some practical guidance for navigating the complexity of this political landscape that we've heard about from Reverend Franek, and now that we've got the biblical and theological frameworks from Reverend Ravel? How can we maintain a commitment to integrity and Christ-centered teaching?
Well, thanks for framing it that way, Leah, and thanks to you and Brianna for moderating this, and to the Wisconsin Council of Churches and the Clergy Emergency League for hosting it. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be on this panel with Robert and with Nelson. So as you mentioned in your introduction, Leah, from 2006 to 2018, I was the leader of 350 UCC churches in Massachusetts. Then, as now, we were concerned about how the church can effectively live out its call to be stewards of truth. In May of 2017, I convened the pastors and the leaders of our churches so that we could have a conversation much like the one we're having in this webinar. I want to share my opening comments from 7.5 years ago so that you can see that the crisis we're in now has been building for some time. This is what I told them in 2017. Our very understanding of truth, upon which public discourse depends as it seeks to bend the arc of history toward justice, our very understanding of truth is under attack. Words have become tools to convey power. Words no longer refer to reality. Yet week in and week out, you and your congregation are engaged in the public square, advocating for justice, empowering disenfranchised, correcting misunderstanding, bridging differences, healing wounds, fighting inequality. To be clear, this is what it looks like to follow Jesus. But this witness, your ministry, is in jeopardy if our society abandons truth. Truth is a foundation of justice. Nonviolent advocacy depends upon both truth and conscience for its persuasive power. Without truth as a currency, there can be no social contract. Without truth, there is only power. So as Robert has made clear, 7.5 years later, as we preach from our pulpits and reach out to the least of these among us in the public square, the light we need to expose injustice, exploitation, racism, and so much more, truth itself, that light has been dimmed. However, as Robert and Nelson both have made clear, the light of truth has not been extinguished. Every Sunday, your congregation gathers to hear God's word. They view you as a trusted messenger who has been called by God to tell the truth. To help with that, here are my practical suggestions for navigating the complexity of our current political landscape while maintaining a commitment to the integrity of Christ-centered teaching. My first practical suggestion for faithful leadership in a time such as this is to be transparent with your congregation about how you discern the truth that you shape from the pulpit. Share with them your sources, just as Robert did at the beginning of his comments, and why you trust those sources. And as you do, invite your congregation to ponder where they turn for truth. If something you shared is later found to be a lie, tell them, apologize, model what it means to confess. Pray for the strength to allow yourself to become more and more vulnerable in your honest transparency and truth-telling. Help your congregation understand that when it comes to distinguishing truth from deception, God cannot be deceived. Accepting this reality is like holding a moral compass when we are lost in a maze of conflicting ideologies. To be a person of faith means to strap on a life preserver as we commit to seeking truth, even as the waves of disinformation, distrust, alternative facts, fake news, and self-deception break over us. That leads to my second practical suggestion. As you model transparency and vulnerability in your preaching, find ways to encourage your congregation to become a safer place, safe enough for people to honestly share their diverse views about things that matter. In her books and her blogs, Leah Schad provides many good suggestions on how to do this. My third practical suggestion for faithful leadership is for you to identify another preacher with whom you can talk regularly, someone who will hold you accountable and whom you can hold accountable in your proclamation of God's word. While ministry is often isolating and lonely, prophetic ministry is even more so. No one can do this work alone. Talking with a trusted partner over time allows a depth of honesty and transparency to emerge. And having shared in that way gives me the courage to be more open, straightforward, and vulnerable in my public ministry. My fourth practical suggestion speaks to our present moment. And perhaps you've done this already. Consider preaching an election sermon. I believe that engaging public life is as important as any purpose of the church. Called as we are to serve God in a time when the stability of our democracy, the authority of our Constitution, and the rule of law is under attack, it's long past due that we address from the pulpit the crisis of our democracy. We can no longer be bystanders as white Christian nationalists prepare to transition our government from a democracy to a theocracy. During my 20 years serving as a local pastor in 2 congregations, I preached many election sermons. While the many election sermons I delivered were obviously political, none of them were partisan. I never endorsed a candidate and rarely mentioned them. Indeed, I did my best to provide my congregation with what I discerned to be the timeless moral principles that should guide our political decision-making. Principles that are not only rooted in our faith tradition, but are supported by every faith tradition I know of. Here's a fifth suggestion. This coming Sunday, I'll be preaching a sermon on the sacred right to vote. And between now and Election Day, you might consider doing that yourself. Voting is about what matters and who counts. Voting, understood as a sacred right, affirms what so many people of faith believe that whatever Senator Raphael Warnock asserts, and now I'm quoting from Raphael Warnock, democracy is the political enactment of a spiritual idea. If I have a spark of the divine, I ought to have a voice in determining the direction of my country and my destiny in it. Now, there's 2 problems with this. First, our founding fathers didn't see it that way. They understood voting as a privilege according to land-owning white men. And the second problem is that among our elected officials, the most forceful proponents of voter restriction and the most prolific prevaricators are often one and the same. What often unites them is that they understand themselves to be righteous crusaders, called by God to set aside fairness and truth so that they can fulfill their God-given right to rule as they restore our nation to the Christian values on which it was founded. While this ideology goes by many names, it's commonly called Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism or the New Apostolic Reformation. Living as we are amidst the most contentious run-up to an election anyone can remember, you and your congregation would certainly benefit from a sermon on our sacred right to vote. Now let me close with a word about the vocation of the church today. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in an earlier time of upheaval, the church must be reminded that it is not the master of the state, not the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state. You and I have been called to a position of faithful leadership in a time when our public life, our civic life, and even our understanding of truth itself are under threat. All of this places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on every one of us. It urges our generation to embrace a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, and vocation. That's what Charles Finney did in the 1830s when he inspired countless congregations to join the abolitionist movement by making that commitment their center of their congregation's vocation. And that's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer did in the 1930s as well. Finney and Bonhoeffer both recognized the need for the church to adopt new practices as an expression of a new understanding of vocation. We must do the same. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Jim, that was amazing, helpful, laid it all out there. I've highlighted your practical steps in the chat there. Thank you so much for that. We invite all of you, if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. While you're thinking of questions, I am going to throw one out to the panel. Tonight, we are going to see the first and only debate between the vice presidential candidates. And if it's anything like the last debate between the presidential candidates, one of those candidates is going to repeatedly spew lies and not be fact checked. That's been made very clear. There will be no fact checking. So I'm thinking about what happens on Sunday morning when people come in to church having heard certain things, and how can pastors and congregational leaders, because we do have some congregational leaders, how can they prepare themselves spiritually to respond to the vitriol and just blatant racist lies that are going to come out from one of the candidates tonight? Robert, let's start with you on that.
Well, I think the first way to be prepared for it is to be informed about what's happening, to be engaged in the debate, to be engaged in the reporting around the debate, to know what surfaces, just knowing that there will be millions of people that will watch the debate live tonight. More people will see the debate on social media and news reports in the coming days, truncated down to the sound bites that make for news, apart from the context of the larger conversation. So know that. So I think it's helpful for leaders then to have the background of seeing the context of the whole debate, to know the context of the questions that were asked, what was said, how was it said, for both candidates, and then to be informed themselves about what is the truth. right? This is all about telling the truth, and to know, okay, this person is saying these lies because they're pushing this particular agenda, and this is the truth that I need to know to counter these lies and vitriol.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Robert. Nelson, you serve a community that has been the victim of smear campaigns, um, uh, 2 years worth of lies told about your vulnerable community. And I'm just talking about, uh, a specific incident. Of course, the immigrant and migrant community gets lots of vitriol all the time. You minister to these folks. So when you see things like, blatant lies told about immigrant communities, what is that like for you as a pastor?
I appreciate that question so much, for Dr. Shade, because when, to give you an example, when we were celebrating our first anniversary 2 weeks ago on September 15th, several of the prayers and were around precisely that issue, how we build up the community when we are speaking of or against the you might say the using the migrant community as a, I guess the best way to describe it, they're being used as an issue. Like we're talking about a community, but they're being described as an issue. So it humanizes them.
Yes.
So the first thing that as a pastor that it hit me is the fact that these are my people. These are the community. This is the community I'm serving. So to uplift and highlight their dignity as children of God, first of all, and their contributions to society, and how California, in particular, where we are, which is sometimes the fifth or sixth economy in the world, without the migrant community, would not be in that place. It's not just Hollywood and high tech that makes California, the largest economy. It's also the agricultural work, agricultural industry. So without the migrant labor, without the migrant community, and in this state, it's about 40% of the people in this state are Latinx, mostly Mexican descendants, Mexican American or Mexican nationals who live and call California their home. We're talking about the largest section or sector of the population. So for anyone or politician or leader to bring no, it's not just insults, it's lies. Like we're talking about truth telling, to bring lies and to distort the numbers and distort the narrative to to put like make a blanket statement about the evil nature of the migrants and the migrant community and immigration itself. What it requires from us as pastors is just a very strong, faithful, loving response that counters that narrative without, and I'll say this, maybe I'll get in trouble, but without any apologies. I don't think that, when we're talking about people, this is I guess the difference in my context from maybe other contexts is that the people who are being attacked directly are in the pews. This is not maybe an issue out there, and it's not we're having empathy for someone out there. No, these are the people that I have right in front of me. So that's why I appreciate the question so much. I think it requires a level of solidarity, between the pastor, the congregation, but also ultimately, and I'll finish with this statement. Bring politicians. And to give you an example, recently we brought most major candidates that were running for office in the city of Stockton and around for our state and our region. we brought them to the church to meet with the families. Many times politicians don't want to talk to migrants, or because they think, well, they're not going to vote. So the idea was to, on one hand, give voice to the migrant community to be able to tell directly to the elected officials, no. You may not be able to vote, but your children might be, and you might be even in the process of becoming a citizen down the road. So now you live here with us, you're part of our community, and following, the recommendation of the book of Exodus, we shall treat the resident migrant among us as one of us. Therefore, speak to the truth to power as one of us, as if you were a citizen. So I think that's you might say, the empowerment that pastors and leaders need to give to communities that are being attacked or marginalized.
Oh, that is incredibly helpful. And I would add too that if for our listeners, if you're in a congregation that is a congregation of privilege, build relationships with congregations like the one Reverend Nelson serves, so that you can, like you said, hear the truth by getting closer to the margin. That's where you're going to find the truth, and that's where you're going to find Christ. Jim, I want to pitch a question to you that came from one of the people who are listening, and it has to do with a segment that was on Rachel Maddow's show last night. It was highlighting